Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to the 4.7 Phase 2 banner review. We have Sigewinne coming out, and we have a Furina rerun. They're accompanied by Noelle, Rosaria, and Gaming, and the weapon banner obviously has both of their signatures with Sacrificial Bow, Lion's Roar, Vonius Codex, Vonius Lance, and Lithic Blade. But as usual for these, we're gonna go through all the characters one at a time and yap a lot, so I hope you enjoy. First, we're gonna talk about Sigewinne. Now, this is a character for which I have not done a pre-release analysis because I don't think there's enough to say to justify one. So this section is gonna be a little bit longer than usual because I can't refer you guys to a pre-release that I have done. So, Sigewinne is an HP scaling healer, ascends with HP, very cool. She heals on her skill with a bubble that heals every time it bounces, and it's team-wide healing. It's kind of basically sustained team-wide healing, a little bit like what you'd see from Noelle's healing if you were to keep her on field. Yeah, a little bit like Xianyuan, except it doesn't have that front-loaded healing at the start. It does very minimal damage, almost insignificant. Then her ultimate is effectively Neuvillette charge attack, except it does less damage and has a significantly longer animation time because the burst animation is pretty long. She has a passive that buffs skill damage in the same way that Shenhe buffs power damage with a flat damage increase. It's not a very large amount of damage, but it's not completely insignificant. Overall, she's a character that has pretty good healing, but kind of nothing else. Her Hydro application isn't the best. It's pretty underwhelming. Her damage is also pretty underwhelming. The main appeal that she has is that she is a team-wide healer that does somewhat synergize with Furina because she buffs skill damage and is another Hydro character, which gives you Hydro resonance. The problem is that there just aren't a lot of teams where that's enough to justify a slot. Pretty much every other team has things that are, or has access to healers that do more than a little bit of a buff to Furina's damage. And her Hydro app isn't enough to justify playing her in teams that require a Hydro unit in the same way that you can use Kokomi. Now, she's a unit that is very casual friendly in the sense that her healing is all coming from her skill, not burst. So if you're a new player, you're not used to the energy system, making sure that you battery your characters properly, you will be able to get all of your healing out of her. It's team-wide healing, so it applies to everyone. Her main appeal, in my eyes, is she is a fine, overworld healer. I think the main teams are it's fine, where you're playing her and you're not feeling bad about it from a team building perspective, is to some extent in freeze teams. If you really want to run 2 Hydro units with Furina, you're looking for a healer, that's okay. Kind of in freeze teams where you want a healer but you're not running Furina as solo Hydro, but her Hydro app is a little scuffed, so it's not ideal. I remember when Navia came out, a decent amount of people really liked the comfort of playing Furina Kokomi teams with Navia, the last unit being another Geo character. They thought that there were teams that were relatively comfortable to play, that didn't have to worry too much about rotations or multi-wave stuff. And I think that Sigewinne will fit very well in that. I think she might actually be better than Kokomi. The loss of TDDS is a bit rough, obviously, but it's okay. I think she can have a place in that team. Other than that, it's really just if you really like her, you can obviously play her wherever. But I generally don't like talking too much about constellations, but I think you kind of have to with Sigewinne. She's one of the characters that gains the most from constellations in the game. At C0, she's a bad healer, basically. At C6, she's a better Neuvillette. Not a better C6 Neuvillette, but a better Neuvillette. Her C1 helps her application, helps her damage, it's alright. Her C2 gives her a shield when she holds, but from what I understand, the shield doesn't actually carry over when you swap out of her, so it's not a real shield. It's basically just resistance to interruption when you're casting your stuff. But it's also Hydro Res Shred, which is pretty good. C3 is skill damage and healing, which is pretty worthless. C4 extends her burst duration by 3 seconds, which, considering that her default burst duration is 2.5 seconds, is a pretty big deal. C5 increases the damage, right, through talent levels of that burst. And then C6 significantly increases the damage of that burst. And at C6, you can effectively think of her as a character that has a much stronger Neuvillette charge attack but it doesn't last for as long, right? It's like 5.5 seconds, and then it's gone. The thing is, she also, her signature weapon, which we'll talk about later, also gives her specifically and her alone a pretty big buff. Again, like I don't like talking about things like this because I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, if I want to make Sigewinne work, I have to spend money. Like, you don't. She's still a reasonable healer at C0. But yeah, with Constellations, she can become a pretty decent damage dealer. And again, right, she's not released yet, so this stuff is subject to change. But she gets strong resistance to interruption while she's holding her E, which she can hold to make it heal more, do a bit more damage. Fine to hold. And she gets infinite resistance to interruption when using her Q. Her skill application is fine. Her burst application is awful. It hits a decent amount of times, but it has special ICD, which makes it so that it only ends up applying Hydro up to 2 times, which means she's not actually very good at shield breaking. I think it's very funny that they're releasing the Hydro character that has arguably the worst Hydro application that we've ever had, outside of maybe Hydro MC, in an Abyss where there's a pretty important and significant Hydro shield breaking check, or like pyro shield breaking check. I think it's quite funny. Anyways, I think that's enough on Sigewinne. Overall, definitely not a character that you'll be regretting skipping if you don't get her. You can still go for her if you don't care that much about character strength, but it's definitely not something I would generally recommend. And then we have Furina, which is a different situation. Furina is obviously much better. I think people overrate Furina a little bit because I think people are under the impression that she's very necessary for a lot of teams to be good, whereas if you were to just replace her for another Hydro in a lot of these teams where she's good, it really wouldn't be that big of a difference. However, that doesn't mean she's bad in those teams. She's still, in a lot of teams, the best option. And like, when I say that she's overrated, I don't mean that she's bad. I mean that she's great, and people think she's a bit greater than she actually is, in my opinion. I don't think there are that many carries that actually need her to be good, other than maybe Noelle to some extent. Or yeah, other than like the carries that provide healing themselves, right? So like Noelle, Dory, that are like actually pretty good with her because you don't have to sacrifice something in their team to get a healer in order to make use of Furina. You're already healing, which means that without Furina, the teams are just significantly worse. Plunge teams in general that are forced to run Xianyun also quite like her. But yeah, like as a general rule, right? If your team is like pretty much forced to run a team-wide healer, she tends to be a very strong option. If your team is running Bennett, she is still a strong option, but not as necessary. All in all, she is strong. She's not anywhere close to necessary. There's a few characters that don't even really want her in their teams, but when it comes to like, is she worth going for from a meta perspective, she's one of the characters that is definitely better. When it comes to the 5 stars, I hold her in pretty high regard. I think that she's definitely up there as like, if you're pulling from meta only, the 5-star characters that you want to grab when you have enough primos to get them and they're on banner. I think it's like her, Kazuha, Nahida, now probably Nevilette as well, to some extent Elon, but maybe a bit less so. And those are like the characters that I view as like, even if you don't really like them specifically, getting them will likely make it easier for you to build your teams around the units that you do like. So they're worth a consideration even if you're not a fan of their kit or playstyle. Whereas I don't think that's the case with the rest of the 5-star roster. I think that as a general rule, you can pretty much go over whoever you want and make them work pretty well. I think especially in this Abyss, she's like, I mean, in this Abyss, she's alright. The fact that she gives a buff that carries over multi-wave makes her pretty good in the first side of Chamber 1, as well as the second side of Chambers 2 and 3. And then the fact that she's a Hydro unit makes her decent, at least in Chamber 1 second half, but her application isn't really enough by itself. You're probably going to be needing to run another unit that can deal with shields along with her. And then when it comes to constellations, her C1 is just a good constellation altogether. It's alright. I would definitely recommend C1 over her signature, unless the only thing you care about is the damage numbers that she's doing. But C2 also is something I would probably go for before I go for the signature. Even C3 I would probably go for before signature. I think it's at C4 that I would probably go for signature. signature before it. And honestly, the main reason for that is just because she has such good 4-star options. There are a lot of teams where you play her where both she and the rest of the team is pretty energy dependent, which makes her synergy with ER weapons pretty high, and which makes it so that her signature, which doesn't give you any energy, while still generally better than the other options, isn't as much better than the other options as you'd expect. I think it's also worth noting that if you already have Key of Kajnisut, it's maybe not even worth going for her signature, because there are a lot of situations where Key is similar, a little bit behind, sometimes even a little bit ahead because of the buff it gives to the rest of the team in reaction teams. But yeah, so for those of you that are looking to vertically invest into her, I would say that up until C4, I generally go for constellations over weapons. However, if you're going for constellations, that means you're going to get a lot of copies of these 4-star characters, so let's talk about them. We're going to start with Noelle. I've already briefly mentioned her as a carry that benefits a lot from Furina. I think it makes a lot of sense for Noelle to be on Furina's banner. I definitely think that, like, if you're going to put Noelle on any banner, it should be either Furina or, like, maybe Chiori or something like that. Furina is in almost every single one of Noelle's best teams now. Her release made Noelle a lot better. Noelle is still not, like, this amazing unit, but her ability to consolidate her damage in AoE in a way that makes it very easy to hit every single enemy gives her pretty significant advantages over a lot of other units. Or a lot of people don't realize how good Noelle's charge attack is, not because its damage is insane, but because of how its AoE works effectively. Let's say you have your Abyss Chamber, you have an enemy here. If you're looking at stuff like Noelle's normal attack, or any sort of ability that hits in a cone in front of you, in order for it to be able to hit everything here, you'd effectively need AoE this big. But Noelle's charge attack has the, not unique, but somewhat rarer property of being centered around her and not caring about the auto-targeting, which makes it so that you can hit all enemies just by using your charge attack in the middle here. But what I'm getting at is that the best possible shape for AoE abilities is a circle that goes all around you and that doesn't, like, move forward or backwards based on auto-targeting. And with Noelle, when you're holding her charge attack, you can move in any direction you want. That's the main reason why so many people feel that Kazuha's skill is incredible at grouping enemies, because it's a lot easier to use. Alright, if I want to go behind me, if I want to go left, if I want to go right, I can go any direction I want. On top of that, very often enemies have hitboxes that prevent you from actually being yourself here when you do your AoE, right? The enemy's gonna have a hitbox, and you're gonna have a hitbox, which means that you're gonna start here, which makes the AoE necessary significantly bigger. Whereas if you don't have that, and you're just starting here, you're not interfering with the enemy hitboxes, which again, right, helps you consolidate your AoE so much better. All of this to say, Noelle isn't just a unit that has decent AoE, she's a unit that has great AoE consolidation, even though just looking at the size of her AoE, it's not actually that much bigger than other characters. When it comes to her constellations, the big one is the C6. It gives you a pretty big buff or a pretty big increase to the buff you get from the burst. But there is also already a pretty big difference between Noelle C0 and C5. Obviously, the C5 itself gives you 3 levels of the ult, which isn't quite as much as the 50% you get from the C6, but you go from 72 to 85. That's a nice little 13. It's all right. Her C4 is actually the one that I consider to be probably the best one after C6. When your skill duration expires or is destroyed by damage, she deals 400% of her attack as 0 damage. And obviously, right, you're like, oh, attack, but she's a defense scaler? No. She gains an attack buff based on her defense. So dealing damage based on her attack is great. And if you're just looking at the motion value of her stuff initially, right? On a full max investment Noelle, for each hit of her charge attack is 100% motion value, which means that this is an equivalent amount to 4 additional hits of your charge attack. Now, generally, this isn't going to be hitting every single enemy because the AoE of it is a lot smaller, but there are generally enemies that are squishier than others, and if you're aware that you have this, you can try to position yourself so that the tankier enemies are in range of this, and the squishier ones aren't. C3 is shield levels, which is alright. C2, charge attack damage and charge attack stamina consumption reduction, it's alright. And then C1, effectively better healing in your ult. Important thing to know with Noelle is that map canceling is broken, especially when you have her C2+, because this reduced stamina consumption means that you have more stamina to work with. Usually, if I hold my charge attack, we don't look at her weapon. If I hold my charge attack, after a little bit, which is about half of her stamina, a little bit more than half on other characters, but her stamina reduction obviously helps, she goes and does the final swing guaranteed, which means that if the enemies aren't dead yet, you're gonna have to do the final swing, and then start another charge attack, which is gonna take a while because the initial windup of the charge attack is pretty long. However, if you open any menu during your charge attack, you can then, even without holding the camera, it'll keep doing the charge attack until you're completely out of stamina. It's not a complicated trick. It's not an obscure one either. Most people who play Noelle know this, but I mean, if you're looking at this wondering which character to play, which character to pull for, whatever, you might not know it. So I wanted to mention it because it's very important. So I think that pretty much does it for Noelle. Overall, again, pretty good character in AoE, but outside of Furina teams, doesn't tend to do all that well in terms of damage. It is also important to note that Goro does a lot for her. So if you don't have High Constellation Goro, you will see a difference in her damage. If you don't have Goro at all, that's also going to be rough. Next up, Rosaria. Rosaria is a character that, I don't want to say she got worse over time, but like she kind of did. So it used to be the case that she was part of the best lineup you can make for Abyss with only 4-star characters. That's something that can be important because knowing what the best default 4-star only teams are can help you decide what your second team should be. If you're relatively new, you pulled for a 5-star character, you only have one team you can make with them, you're not really sure what else to do on the other side, you can take a look at what are the strong 4-star only teams and try to do something with that. And so that used to be very relevant. However, with the release of Dendro in 3.0, and, Dendro main character, if you consider him a 4-star, or other Dendro 4-stars since, that's not really the case anymore. I would say that the 2 best 4-star only teams now are probably Sucrose National and Hazel Aggravate. Sucrose National has been the best 4-star only team since 1.0, but doing it before Dendro came out left you with a very weak second side. You can do Chevreuse, Xiangling, Beidou, Fischl as an alternative to the Aggravate. Basically, you now have a lot more options for 4-star only teams that don't use Rosaria. That being said, this Abyss, because of the elemental application check in the second half of the first chamber, hurts National a bit and heavily favors Taser, which is the other side when you're playing Reverse Melt Rosaria on one side and Taser on the other, right? That's what the best 2 4-star only teams used to be. Which means that if you look at the 4-star only clears that are available out there, you look at Sevi's video, I know that Eeks was doing a 4-star only clear as well with Rosaria. Rosaria is seeing a bit of a resurgence. I think that overall, Rosaria's okay. And obviously outside of 4-star only teams, she's also a fine option in Melee teams, in Freeze teams, but she's just not amazing. She's a very okay unit that can be used, but is never going to be all that great. Oh yeah, she's also recently seen, she's appeared in a new 4-star only team with Gumming's release as well, which is also pretty good, kinda. It's a lot more circle impacty than the default reverse melt one. Anyways, all in all, it's not that she got weaker, or even that the gap between her teams and other teams got that much bigger. It's just that her main value really used to be that the 4-star only teams didn't have a lot of options, and now they do. Constellations, C1 is completely useless because her normal attacks suck, so normal attack speed and normal attack damage don't do anything. Her C2 is quite good. It increases the duration of her ult, which helps her with application and damage. Her C3 is okay. It gives her skill damage, which is fine. Her C5 gives her some energy, which helps with her ER requirements. Her C4, sorry. Her C5 is burst damage. It's a bit better than C4, or than C3. And her C6 shreds physical resistance, which is pretty useless in almost every team, but pretty good for for physical teams. All in all, Rosaria, I'd say, is a fine unit to have on banner, but definitely not one I'm too excited for. And then finally, we have Gaming. And Gaming is a very interesting character. I know that there was a lot of talk about him before his release, about him being the best new 4-star carry. And one thing you may have noticed since he came out is that no one talks about him anymore. In my pre-release, I talked about, while he can definitely be a very strong character, he has a lot of issues that arise in game, like while you play him, that can prevent him from reaching that very high strength, and that are going to make him feel a lot worse to play. And that is indeed what ended up happening. He is strong, but if anything goes wrong, he becomes very bad. He's incredibly reliant on actually getting his reactions, and because in a lot of his teams, the reactions are very dependent on application that happens at specific intervals rather than after specific actions. It means that when you have to dodge, when you get hit, all of that, it changes the frequency of his application, which can interfere with the application you're getting from the rest of the team. He's also often very stuck to a circle. He doesn't carry over all that well over multiple rotations, and his AoE is really not great before C6. However, just looking at the damage, he's actually pretty strong. Let's go through his constellations very quickly. Honestly, C1, C2 don't really matter. C3 is pretty good. C4 and C5 don't really matter. C6 is very good. He's one of those characters, very similar to Noelle, I'd say. Probably more so than Noelle, who benefits a lot from his C6. If you really like Gaming, and me talking about this makes you afraid to use him, keep in mind, those issues that he has are mainly in his best teams. If you're willing to sacrifice a bit of team power, a bit of actual DPS output, you have comfier team options that are a lot less vulnerable to those issues. If you're playing him without Bennett, in double Hydro teams mainly, a lot of his consistency issues don't necessarily disappear, but aren't nearly as big of a deal. That being said, those teams are noticeably weaker. All in all, having a C6 versus not having a C6 is a very noticeable difference. I say that as someone who got so fucking close. And boy, it is very noticeable. That basically does it for Gaming, which means we can give an overall evaluation of the quality of the banner now. I think Noelle mains are eating good, because if you don't have Noelle C6 yet, you get to go for those constellations on a banner that has a character that is great for Noelle teams, but then on top of that, that also whose constellations are still quite good for Noelle teams. I guess Gaming mains are eating good as well, because Furina is also very often in Gaming's teams. But yeah, I think if you wanted to get Furina for a team that isn't Noelle or Gaming, this banner is probably a disappointment for you. No like versatile great support characters like Fischl, Singseo, Sucrose that are really good to have. Bennett, whatever. If you're a newer player, they're not that great either, because Noelle and Gaming before C6 are not the best, and Rosaria just in general also not really the best. Furina is still good enough that it's worth a consideration, but it's definitely a bit of a disappointment on the 4 stars. But yeah, let's move on to the weapon banner. So we have Sigewinne's signature and Furina's signature. Furina's signature gives her effectively 100% uptime on 24 damage percent for her skill and 28 HP percent. It's not a very versatile weapon that can be used for by other characters. It's pretty much just for her. It's a good stat stick, but that's kind of it. Again, there are quite a few teams where Key is competitive, if not even just better than her signature. And so if you care about getting a very strong Furina, this isn't even that good, and that matters a lot because the other weapon on this banner, Silvershower Heartstrings, is awful. It is an amazing weapon for Sigewinne and an awful weapon for literally everyone else. The equipping character gains a remedy effect that gives you max HP based on the amount of stacks that you have. You gain a stack from using skill, which is attainable for anyone, increasing your bond of life value, which is something that, as far as bow characters are concerned, I think only Sigewinne can do, and performing healing, which is something that I guess Diona can also do. Linny, if you're really feeling up to it. Fischl, true. Goro, technically, but obviously it doesn't matter that they can trigger it because the weapon is awful on them. Basically, when it comes to characters that could use this, right, you could use it maybe on Diona. I guess you get 2 stacks out of it, 24 HP and then 66, so 90% HP, which is okay, but it's never going to be better than Sac or Fav, so it doesn't really matter. And then other HP scaling bow users, Yelan will only be able to get 1 stack out of it. When you have 3 stacks, you also get 28% crit rate for your burst, which is an insane effect, but that is literally only available to Sigewinne. That's what I was saying earlier when I said that her signature weapon does a lot for her, at least for her damage, but it is like completely useless on everyone else. 40% HP and 28% crit is an insane effect. The stat line is not the best, but low base attack is great for non-attack scalers. Which means, effectively, this is about as good as a signature can get for the character. The only problem is, at C0, Sigewinne's damage is so awful that even with this, it's not that good. Which means that realistically, this is a weapon that is only really worth considering for Sigewinne mains if you are also going for constellations. Because otherwise, increasing her damage by a decent amount when it's so bad to begin with isn't really as good as just going for a support weapon. On Yelan, it's slightly better than the damage-focused options, right? You get 78% HP, and that's it. It's slightly better than stuff like Slingshot, from what I've looked at. It was about 5% better with my assumptions, but obviously, depending on your assumptions, that can change. The thing is, Slingshot is already only really used in teams that generate so much energy that Fav is just not worth it, and Fav is generally going to be Yelan's weapon, and it's not better than Fav if you need the energy, obviously. Then we have the 4 stars. Sacrificial Bow is not great. It can be used on Goro, it can be used on Diona, it can be used on Yelan, it can be used on Kole, but outside of Kole, Sac Bow is pretty much always worse than Fav. It can be used on Sarah and it's fine on her, sure. But yeah, overall Sac Bow is just not the best. Lion's Roar used to be a pretty good banner, or pretty good weapon to have on banner, because back in 1.0, all the way up until Inazuma, the only free-to-play weapons we had for swords had substats of EM and physical damage percent, which obviously aren't good for just a good attack percent stat stick. And it made it so that Lion's Roar being an attack percent stat stick was a pretty decent option. In Inazuma, Amenoma came out, which made Lion's Roar a lot worse on any character that cared about energy. In Sumeru, Sapwood came out, which didn't really change too much. But in Fontaine, Finale of the Deep came out, which is just a better stat stick than Lion's Roar on most characters. Even with 100% uptime on the passive on Lion's Roar, it's really not often much better than Finale of the Deep, which makes it overall just a very underwhelming weapon to be on a banner now. I personally use it on Climb, but that's just because I don't want to spend the billets to craft Finale of the Deep. Next up, we have Favonius Codex, which is pretty good. It used to be a lot worse, but with Nahida's release, it gained a very significant user. It's also good kind of on Baiju, although the stat requirements to make your Fav procs reliable can be kind of high, which means that in teams that don't struggle for energy on other characters than Baiju, you're generally better off using Prototype Amber. It's also pretty good for Charlotte. Overall, it's okay. It's definitely like on the upper half of catalysts that you can have. Favonius Lance is by far the best polearm you can have on a banner. It's great. It's great on most polearm characters. It's great on Xingling in some teams. Great on Zhongli. Good on Rosaria. Surprisingly good on Raiden in a lot of her teams. Great on Toma. Great on Yunjin. Great on Shenhe. Great on Candace. Great on Yao Yao. Great on Mika. Great on Chevreuse. Right? It's like unironically more than half of the polearm characters, their best in slot or a very competitive option is Pavlance. I don't want to talk too much about leaks in the banner reviews, but if you're interested, it is also looking to be a pretty reasonable option on Ibili, one of her better free-to-play options. Finally, we have Lithic Blade, which is not very good. I mean, it's playable on some characters, like it's usable on like Coming, but it's just not really a weapon you're too happy to see. Which means that all in all, we have a kind of below average but okay bow, a not very good sword, a good catalyst, an amazing lance, and a pretty bad claymore. I'd say that the 4-star lineup for this is about average. It doesn't stand out too much because it only has 2 things you're like all that happy to have, and they're both Fav weapons as usual. But it's also not completely bad because like you do have to have weapons. So, the biggest issue with this banner is not the 4 stars, it's the 5 stars. I think obviously if you are a Sigewinne main through and through, like you're gonna go for a signature no matter what. I think that her Splendor of Tranquil Waters being the alternative, the like second weapon on the banner, isn't actually that bad for Sigewinne players, because if you are actually going carry Sigewinne at like whale level, you want to play that with Furina, and you're generating a decent amount of particles, so you don't necessarily need to put Furina on a high ER weapon. But outside of diehard Sigewinne mains, you don't want this at all, and this weapon isn't even that great on Furina, which means that you're going for a weapon that is a relatively minor upgrade, and if you lose your 37.5, 62.5, you get dog shit. And I think that that's enough to make it so that this banner, for most Furina mains, or just Furina players in general, is not worth it. I think this is a significantly below average banner. One of the worst ones for sure, if you are a Furina player. Anyways, I think that's going to be it for the banner review. So as usual, let me know what you think of these slightly longer banner review videos. The reception to them is still positive, so I'm going to keep doing them as long as the reception is positive. If you have anything else you want to add on Furina or on Sigewinne or any of the 3-4-star characters or the weapons, feel free to do so in the comments. Don't forget to check out the second channel if you're interested. By the time this comes out, I should have 3 videos posted, which means that the only requirement left to get that channel monetized is going to be a certain amount of watch hours. So go check it out. It would help a lot. And yeah, I will be seeing you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.